Peace be upon you, and welcome to Way Stations. My name is Rehan Khan. This is the show where we look at what does it mean to be human in the current age. And I'm joined, as always, by my co-host, Dr. Walead Mosaad. Dr. Walead, how are you doing?
I'm doing very well. How are you, Rehan? And I think we have something special going on in this podcast.
Oh, we do have something very special. We have a very special guest with us, Peter Gould, and I'm going to introduce him first and I'll bring him online straight after. So, Peter, as many of you know, some of you may not know, but he's known for something called the Heart of Design. And Peter is a renowned designer, he's an entrepreneur, and he's very much someone who's pioneered heart-centered design for 20 plus years. He's got a lot of mainstream, global kind of brand name clients like Apple and Google, as well as many, many other brands around the world. And he's put a lot of his experience of the last 20 years or so into a book that was published in 2025 called The Heart of Design, a beautifully designed book. And it really helps to think through spiritual aspirations and strategic design principles. And Pete's been running a course as well with the same name, Heart of Design, which I think nearly maybe 1,000 people have been through now and have really benefited. Now, Peter himself is a recipient of the Stanford Certificate for Innovation and Entrepreneurship. He's the winner of several international awards. He's also an ambassador for UN refugees in Australia and lives there with his wife, his family, and he's based in Sydney. And very big welcome from us, Peter.
Thank you so much, Rehan and Waleed. Wonderful to be with you both. I've really been enjoying the Way Station series, and a big blessing to be on here among many amazing guests and very beautiful conversations you've had. So I hope I can contribute something, but I love to learn from both of you. I really look up to the work you've done and the conversations you lead. So really just great to be with you on today's episode.
Thank you, Peter. So we're really looking forward to this conversation. So let's get started. I think one of the things I probably want to just to begin with is ask you is that you're very much known as a designer, as an innovator, but perhaps can you just share with us a little bit about your own journey, your kind of backstory that led you to this field of design?
Yeah, thank you. No, really happy to share. So I grew up in Australia, in Sydney, southern Sydney, and I at a young age, I was one of those kids that liked to draw and scribble, and probably got in trouble for drawing on walls, or covering books in little doodles and things that I may have been trying to hopefully study other subjects. And I think, my parents were supportive in that even from a young age, they put me into things like art school on the weekend. And I even had a memorable holiday period during a cartooning school, which I thought was very, in hindsight, you appreciate the great blessing if your parents are able to help you with that kind of education. So I had sort of that creative streak in terms of the visual art. But I also was growing up around, this is sort of the, sort of late 80s, early 90s, when there was a time of incredible technological development around digital art, and even very, very early tech things. Like the graybeards like me will remember things like the Commodore 64 or very early Nintendos, where you could make this quite expressive, vibrant digital art, and big colorful pixels didn't necessarily make realistic graphics, but you could. It was the early development of what then became the internet and early websites, where I love to dabble and experiment with, trying early emerging tech and get my hands on early copies of things like Photoshop and Explore. So I think, I was very fortunate to grow up in that era, early internet. I think it was like my ninth grade science teacher found out that I could make websites, or today they wouldn't really be considered websites, but back then, you could make little information pages. And he made me a deal. He said, Peter, if you make the science department's website, I will let you get out of all the science classes, and you can just do the core pieces at the end. And so I agreed to that deal, and I think that was part of my first step into the world of both, client work, if you like, and also appreciating, if you can create, use design and technology and art to help solve a problem, that can be valuable in the world. So, that was some of my early adventures into that, and first steps into the world of the visual art, but also digital creative technology, which it was a very formative era for for someone like me.
Yeah, and I guess what that shows is that a lot of the exposure that our parents give us, especially in our early formative years, it really does kind of percolate out throughout your whole kind of career. Now, as part of your design journey, you talk a lot in the book and on your classes and on other shows that you've been on. You talk about discovering some kind of spiritual path with regards, your own design journey. Now, for many people, that might feel a bit, what's that design got to do with spiritual paths? And they seem to be two different paths, and you're talking about it being one path. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, so I was happily experimenting with all these creative projects and processes. And in my late teens, I encountered a Muslim family that lived in the area not far from me in Sydney, and I became curious through a series of unexpected or unplanned conversations about all of a sudden a much wider, I guess, perspective or a different kind of worldviews and understandings that I hadn't really been exposed to. And I didn't necessarily have the kind of the language or the references to explore these with a lot of my own kind of upbringing. I didn't really have any kind of religious or faith-based sort of instruction or environments. But I became very curious and really, went through a period of around 18, 19, 20, going to meet and learn more and become curious with people on what I would call the spiritual path, people that are seeking God or trying to bring a very kind of a holistic understanding of their life. And I was sort of, for example, as I was entering university, a lot of the kind of conversations, let's say in design and in the environment I'm in, were very much around the commercial and professional realm, and a lot of that kind of defining, so much of what life is about, and having fulfilling work. And so I resonated with that, but there was something that I would kind of describe as my heart kept calling me to explore and investigate. And I remember one moment going in Sydney to this very beautiful Turkish style mosque or masjid that's in the style of the traditional Ottoman mosques from Mimar Sinan, a great architect through history. And it's pretty much, you could imagine this mosque, existing on the Bosphorus. It's the same look and feel, but just, in the middle of, suburban Sydney. So I remember going there, being curious, and if I'm honest, a little bit anxious and unsure, but being very impressed with the feeling. And it was an experiential moment that it had a spiritual type of quality. Again, I didn't necessarily have the language to describe what that was, but it was the designed experience, the calligraphy, the flowing domes, the spatial, the lighting, the carpets, centuries of design tradition, all beautifully coming together in this harmony, the tile work, the beautiful tulips. People that might have visited a Turkish style mosque will know what I'm talking about. And I felt like there was a series of moments, way stations, if you like, to keep exploring further and further into where this is coming from, what's the source of something like this. And the long story short is that I ended up embracing Islam during the month of Ramadan when I was 20 years old. And I was a little bit shy to share it to people at the time, especially, the kind of, the media landscape and different things happening in the cultural context. But it was quite a profound moment, of course, for anyone that's exploring or seeking God. So I think of the spiritual path as really seeking and trying to know God and then trying to live in alignment. So your heart feeling aligned with the guidance that we're able to benefit from, this timeless, universal spiritual guidance. But in particular with Islam, it became to be very clear. That was very clear that the teachings, that was very beautiful way to access knowledge that was, universally agreed and easy to access and standard in all parts of the world. So those first steps became a foundation, and now I'm 44, so that was 24 years ago. Alhamdulillah, it's been a very beautiful journey exploring these two paths. So the creative path, the path of design, and then the spiritual path. And as you said, Rihan, it's been an exploration in how these come together, and in fact, how they are in deep harmony when they're in alignment, and when your spiritual path is in informing your approach to design and your creative practice.
Great, great. So, Dr. Walead, if I can just bring you in here, with regards to the kind of the spiritual path and it resonating with the human path, could you maybe just add some comments to that as well?
Thank you, Peter, for that. That was very interesting, and I know we've had conversations a lot about this before. And one of the things I was just thinking about when you said that your spiritual path informs your creative path, I think the reverse also is true. I think your creative path can also inform your spiritual path. There's one of the Muslim sages, Ahmed Zarruq, he said that the closest path to God is the one that's closest to you, the one that resonates with you. So I think, in a sense, people who are drawn to create things and to look at things, as you say in your book, from a design mindset, will tend to have a particular way of how they focus on their spirituality. And I found that with many artists. You mentioned some in your book, like Yusuf Cat Stevens and others. And I think they actually, for me, seem to have more of a default spirituality to them, I think, based upon their concept of creativity and wanting to kind of, produce something and put something out in the world and bring people to a particular sense of beauty. I mean, what is art at the end of the day except helping people recognize what's beautiful in the world? And if we talk about Muslim art or Islamic art, then the ultimate beauty is the beauty of the divine, the beauty of God. And so then anything that you do kind of accentuates that and brings you to that. And that, if nothing, is spiritual. So I think they're intertwined. And I think anyone who's on that particular path, and I define spirituality very loosely, just have a recognition of something bigger than yourself, bigger than your own kind of personal preferences and needs and things that are generally attached to the ego. But if you can see beyond that, which I think really, that's the human path, that's what makes us human. The human being can see beyond themselves and not just their own personal needs. And I think anyone who can help people to further that or understand that, whether by what they create or what they put out or even their own selves, is a big addition to our societies and our communities. And we thank you very much for facilitating much of that. Alhamdulillah.
Yeah, no, thank you. And I think if I just add a few things there, I guess, which is, certainly from finding that spiritual path, even within, great works of literature and reading. And this is why it's really important to be quite selective about what we read as well, because, books are generally, a good novel, a great novel is generally read kind of at four levels. You have the literal level, which is the plot, what's happening, it's the page turner and so on. And then the second, more deeper level is the kind of allegorical level, which is what the writer is really saying, what's hidden behind the form, what's the real kind of deeper meaning in the book. And, an example would be like Animal Farm. It's a book about animals taking over a farm, but it's really about the Russian Revolution and what went wrong there. Then you have the kind of third level, which is the more deeper level around the kind of moral interpretation. So what moral dilemmas is the writer putting the characters into, and then how do they resolve those things? So if you look at a book like Shakespeare's Othello, in very much it's the moral questions are about understanding the kind of pernicious, the wicked, malevolent nature of jealousy and of envy, of hasad, in these characters, and really also making excuses for people. So that's the kind of moral level, third level. And then the fourth level is that spiritual interpretation. And that spiritual path you find in the great novels, it's interwoven into the tapestry of the book. So very much literal kind of teaches us what happened, the allegorical, what to believe about what happened, the moral provides a guideline for behavior, and the spiritual really shows you kind of a end goal, an end purpose, an end telos of where things are going. So I think that spirituality is built into many arts, into many pieces of literature as well.
Maybe, Rehan, I'm gonna share one thing you just it came to mind as you're describing that beautifully is one book that I read early on in this sort of search, you might say, is was The Agony and the Ecstasy, which is a historical fiction about Michelangelo, a famous painter and artist, and his relationship, with his own creative practice. And of course, it's a fictional kind of account, but it's very moving, very beautiful. And there's a lot of things I took away from that I think quite timeless. But one of them, incidentally, was also, his clients were annoying. Like the Pope didn't pay him, and he kind of, at that time or some of the patrons, kind of captured him, and he has had to sort of finish the certain works of great art, in the Sistine Chapel and things, under kind of almost duress and managing debt, but also managing stunning work through that difficult striving. And so even though it was, in that talking about a certain period of time, and it was about painting, but also capturing something very beautiful and universal. So that novel, those layers and levels that you were sharing, that's one of those books that I recommend to anyone on that kind of creative exploration. Another one might be is called it's called The Artist's Way by Julia Cameron. And the subtitle of that is Creativity as a Spiritual Practice. And that's been very, very influential for many creative professionals, and definitely myself. And I was fortunate to have a brief conversation with her. I think she's a little bit in her senior years now, but a really incredible resource and book exploring these concepts together in a very practical way. So another good one there.
Yeah, and I think I know a lot of people who've done that artist's way as well, and done it with others in a kind of a sohbah, in a type of book reading group where they've gone through chapter by chapter, week by week, and it's benefited a lot of people, especially journaling and just getting the thoughts down on paper. So we've been speaking a little bit about finding a spiritual path with regards design, art, creativity, literature. But in your book, you also then, Peter, talk about design needing to have not only a spiritual path, but also having spiritual aspirations. So why is that important? Why does design need to have spiritual aspirations?
Yeah, well, I know, Rehan, one of the books that you've shared with the world is all about distraction, and I definitely feel and resonated with that. And many of us every day, if we think about a lot of the products and designed experiences that we interact with each day, are really, you might say, designed for distraction. So, for example, today, within 24 hours. Approximately 120 million kids or young people will play the game Roblox. Approximately 550 million hours of Netflix will be consumed today. YouTube is so high, it's incalculable almost how many, millions and millions of hours. And, the apps we use for work, play, shopping, just about everything. We live in a very, digital optimized world. And of course, there's a spectrum of some of those are really designed for attention, ultimately to just, fuel us with dopamine and get us kind of addicted. And others are convenience, but, pursuit of convenience at all costs. So a lot of I would say some of the best designed talent, if you like, in the world, is kind of pulled into these activities, and everything from video games to digital services. It's how do we optimize to get people spending more and more time. So, especially any parents listening, we know exactly what that is like, and it's a constant battle. Many educators. So, it's not necessarily a problem with the digital technology itself, I think, but it's just how we're kind of designers are not given ethical guidelines in university, for example. My peers that might have been doing law or medicine, there's a kind of a code of practice. There's a code of standards. There's a Hippocratic oath. In product designers, we just kind of work to what the client needs and how we can, work to serve the end goal faster, which is usually in this era very economic or commercial and serving shareholders rather than the thinking about the well-being of the user for a lot of the digital tech. So that's the environment that I detected in the design kind of industry overall. But as I was exploring the spiritual path and spending more time with teachers with different traditional knowledge and access to these beautiful sources of timeless wisdom that really resonated with me, I felt there was a kind of a responsibility to try to apply those beautiful teachings in a practical way for modern product and graphic and digital designers. And it sort of became this, I guess, 10-year journey to try to ask people for advice and seek out different entrepreneurs that were kind of, you might say, on the spiritual path. And ultimately, I just kind of distilled that into a little bit of a hypothesis, which is if we have something that we might call heart-centered design, it's recognizing that when we're designing for people, which is what we do, is, in every person, there is a heart. And in every heart, there is a spiritual state. And we should be very conscious of that if it's a big responsibility. And going a little further, I remember struggling with an issue at one time with the project I was doing and asking a teacher about it. And he said, well, Peter, just hang on a moment. You think you're working on this product, but in reality, it's working on you. There's a deeper spiritual teaching in all of this. And none of this is new. This is all very old. Traditional craftspeople and guilds, apprentice master. There's a deep kind of beautiful tradition and science to many of these things that I've tried to be curious about. So long story there, short, is in the heart of design, it's trying to use contemporary language and tools and examples to invite people to this more traditional understanding of the role and purpose of design, which is not just for convenience and attention and economic gain. It should really consider the spiritual well-being and thinking about the state of the people we're trying to serve, the communities that we can serve, and thinking about creative and entrepreneurial work as a responsibility. It's a trust. How are we doing that in the best way? And I think that's a lifelong journey and search that I continue to explore and discover more all the time.
Yes, Peter. MashaAllah, that's we in Mirhan had many conversations. Maybe you listened to some of the previous podcasts about the idea of distraction, maybe the commodification of our attention. I think we talked about that recently. And one of the things when I was looking at your book is you talk about intention and you talk about niyyah and so forth. And you just mentioned about the vibe or the environment that you find within the tech industry in terms of design. And you mentioned ethical guidelines, but I was curious. It seems like maybe there's a fundamental aspect here that the very intention behind what's making these things the way that they are is, I think it's just profit, and to look at the human being as more than just a commodity and more than just a pay source and something above the bottom line and being in the black and so forth. I think that's a fundamental issue that, without getting into a whole big thing about modern capitalism and so forth, but I think that's kind of playing here at the fundamental of it. And I think what a lot of people struggle with is being in that milieu. That's really, you can't really, it's a huge ship, right? In order to change the direction, it would take a lot to do that. But as individuals, obviously, people have to look for their livelihoods and they have to stake out, what they need to do to get along in this life. And I think they struggle with reconciling that they want to kind of do something very positive and ethical and perhaps moral. But at the same time, they find themselves thrust into this environment where profit is king, and the human being is not looked at as a spiritual being, but rather as a source of income. And so you're not thinking about, if they spend too much time on their Instagram reel, perhaps that's not a good thing. But actually, it's a good thing for our profit margin. So and our advertisers, and so we're not really going to do so much about that. So as someone, I think, who's been in contact with lots of this sort of stuff, I'd be interested to get your take on that process of reconciliation and what would you advise people? How would they go about doing it? What are the things that they should be thinking about?
Yeah, I agree with all of those insights. And again, any parents know exactly the challenge, of navigating our young people, and the challenge that you're up against a $1 billion product that's free, but so many of these experiences are we look for alternatives, look for ways. There's a lot about the environments we need to design, but just coming back to the question, I think this is something that all of us in some level in our professional journeys, we need to have sustainable livelihoods for our families, and to have in this modern era, the cost of education and living and thriving. But how do we do that in alignment is a question I started to face, and I think it's really a lifelong search with perhaps hundreds of decisions every week. And I think, though, coming back a step, it all really starts with that intentionality, being conscious. And when I was going through design school and then later in learning environments, for example, Stanford D School and programs like Y Combinator, which is like a startup accelerator that I did an online sort of version of the main program, is that really the conversations here were so much more about the metrics of attention and return and investment and exiting and having IPOs, and this is sort of the metric of success. But in the kind of spiritually grounded conversations and companions and teachers I was around, it's so much more a focus on that daily awareness and conscious intention setting. And I came across a teacher who has some experience in the spiritual search, but also in professional design. And he had a beautiful quote, which is, design. He said, "Design is how we give form to our intentions. Design is how we give form to our intentions." So if you're a teacher or a homeschooler or a product designer or a tech worker, it's really a reflection of that, where you spend your attention and where you make your intention, and what that looks like. And so I think it's also being conscious of what are the spiritual aspirations, or you might call them, some people might call them the values you try to live by, or sources of wisdom that inform your decisions and how you think about your time and purpose, or timeless virtues. I know Rehan talks a lot about the virtues that we should strive towards that are very timeless. And how do we actively apply those in our professional work? And in the context of design and entrepreneurship, and I'm fortunate to spend a lot of time with startup founders or people aspiring to build their own business or launch their own idea, which is, I think, really great to explore. We should all consider that. It is how do we practically apply these things? So when I was exploring, when I had become Muslim, and I was looking at trying to find answers, books and content about Islamic art, for example, and Islamic design was very beautiful, but it was very kind of esoteric, or it was very almost mystical sometimes, or it was very academic. And I was trying to like ship products with deadlines and get websites done and build brands and those kind of things. So what I've sort of tried to do in the last maybe 10 years is help myself and others around in our community to practically go through activities that help you express your intentions, your guidance as a companions, the audiences and communities you hope to serve, the type of sources of wisdom that will guide your intentions and keep you grounded as part of that design and creative journey. So things like we have the heart-centered design canvas or the heart-centered value proposition. These are all tools and concepts from kind of mainstream startup culture, but kind of infused together with spiritually grounded thinking. So there's a few different tools and techniques that I've seen, alhamdulillah, a lot of people have success with. But also just having the right people around you and the companionship, the sahba. And I know, Dr. Walead and Rehan, you talk a lot about the importance of your environment and your companions to keep you thinking and grounded. So if you are building a product or a business, or you're even just navigating your next professional stage, is how you do that in the sort of most conscious way to help you make those decisions along the road.
Yeah, and I think one thing, thanks, Peter. I think One thing I'd like to just bring in here is when it comes to spiritual aspirations, is this notion of imagination. Now, some would call this khayal, which really, imagination, khayal, it really allows us to make the invisible, i.e., the spiritual, the metaphysical, it allows us to make the invisible world kind of visible, to give it form. And it allows us to trace the visible forms, things that we see, back to their invisible or back to their spiritual, back to their metaphysical kind of meanings. So when we look at imagination now, so imagination in many ways is like an isthmus. It's like a connecting point between two points, between two kind of realities. And it participates in both the realities between the visible and the invisible, between matter and in kind of spirit. I think imagination is one of those things that when we are in tune with that imagination, we can start to trace and see the signs around us and link them back to the divine origins and the divine meaning. So in many ways, spiritual aspirations are all about also imagination. And I think traditional arts around the world, and certainly Islamic arts and design, they all played a really important role in bringing the basic elements of the surroundings, such as light and shade and space and time, color, scent, and silence even, into certain kind of geometric and archetypal realities so that we could remember the divine, right? So I think that was part of the purpose of traditional arts and traditional design. And so in many ways, the imaginal faculty, that khayal, allows us to then, perceive reality as it is, whether that's looking at a tree, a geometric pattern, an ant nest, calligraphy, poetry, but you start to see the pattern and you start to see the divine in everything. And I think one of the around the world, generally, where you see the decline of traditional arts and crafts, you also see a rise in much more polarization, sectarianism, an inability to understand others. Whereas I think when you have more traditional arts and crafts and you have that imaginal faculty, then you have much more of an understanding of other people. And I think if you look at the many of the great scholars within the Muslim world, whether it's Ibn Arabi or Al-Ghazali, they argued that reason and imagination, they need to work together. And by correctly working together, you can interpret the signs of God around you and so on. So yeah, I just wanted to bring that kind of topic of just imagination, khayal, in as part of our spiritual aspirations. Now, Peter, can I come back to you here? Now, we've been speaking about certain spiritual aspirations and, but how can you actually apply these, right? Are there certain kind of design principles that you need to adhere to if you want to try and apply these spiritual aspirations?
Yeah. Well, I'll share a short story. I was fortunate to do some design training at Apple, famous global brand. Many of us probably use Apple technology, at various parts of the day. And I was doing a session with some designers and team members, and I kind of put the question around: have we heard of concepts like Zen or Feng Shui or Wabi Sabi, which are kind of non-Western design philosophies? And then I remember kind of exploring, have you come across Baraka? Have you heard of this term or this word? And the Muslims present, of course, were familiar with it, but people generally hadn't come across it. They might have heard the word, but not too sure. And just as by way of example, Baraka is such beautiful and a kind of fundamental way of thinking about the world on the spiritual path and the kind of intangible, tangible, divine goodness or beauty attached to a thing or an event or an occurrence. I'm sure Dr. Walead can share a more insightful description. But I began to ask questions when I came across words like that. Well, can you design for baraka? Or how might we design for remembrance in an era of design for distraction? And these are the kind of questions. And what I found is that especially in the realm of design or just our designer mindset, which is how we can all embrace. You don't have to be a designer, or your LinkedIn doesn't have to say designer. We can all embrace that kind of problem-solving, creative approach. And I felt just by equipping people or encouraging people to ask questions in a certain way and use certain kind of language, it helps reframe how we might think about a problem or a scenario. So rather than, for example, like, how do we acquire more users? You could change the language to be, how might we serve our community better? Okay. And just by changing that language, the solution space, if you like, or the possibilities and scenarios might change. And you can really expand that to, when you get into the habit of designing the question first, it puts the spotlight on your intentions. And if we get into the habit of kind of designing the questions a little more rather than jumping straight to the solution or the kind of the first thing that comes to us, that's really just starting to think more with the designer mindset. And so if we're trying to explore this from our spiritual path or spiritual perspective, or a God conscious kind of lens in whatever work we're doing, then we just bring that into the questions more directly. And that already is this a simple tool, or how might we, serve our audiences, and how might we, illuminate a heart or encourage, hope. And you can bring that into any business or environment or, organization. And if it's done in the right way, it can be a welcome exercise. So that's one way of doing it, a simple way, just putting effort into designing the questions. And then there's other kind of tools and activities that I've seen work really well, that kind of bring the best, I would say the format or the interface is kind of acceptable in a more corporate environment. So, Canvas tools or value proposition tools, things that feel a bit more serious and kind of businessy, but bake into those, spiritual language, or I might use, heart-centered language, so that people are more open to in that context, as opposed to like a religious lecture or a kind of a heavy, spiritual textbook is not going to be very welcome necessarily. But if you use the sort of intentionality of those texts into modern contemporary language and tools, I've seen some wonderful openings and conversations spark because of that.
Yeah, and I think just on that, I think there are a lot of books out there really where the writers want to get across what they want to get across, but there is a deeper faith-based message in there. So famously, Seven Habits by Stephen Covey is a very devout practicing Christian, and that comes across in the book, but it's a really, really useful book for building good habits, right? Or a book like The Science of Meditation by Dan Goleman and Professor Richard. So they're both Harvard professors, but they're devout Buddhists as well. And so the book is a scientific book on psychology and meditation, but they bring their Buddhism to it, right? Or Small is Beautiful by E.F. Schumacher, who was an economist, and he talks really about the whole kind of the economy should be much more local rather than all this globalization. But then he brings Buddhist principles into it as well. So I think what you're doing is very groundbreaking in the sense of you're talking about design tools that people can use, but there is also a fabric of kind of faith and connectedness, because I think what that does, it gives you rootedness. What you're saying is rooted, it's grounded. Otherwise, it's just very vacuous and it keeps changing. So, but Dr. Reed, if I can just bring you in at this point as well, just to maybe add some comments about applying these kind of spiritual aspirations.
Yeah, thank you, Rehan and Peter. I liked what you said, Peter, about kind of the reframing of things. And I think you find there's a historical precedent for that, looking at, let's say, from a religious perspective, and looking at how when prophets came to their respective peoples and they wanted to call to a way of worshiping God or a different way, it wasn't so much about a complete, I think, upheaval of of cultural norms and society, in as much it was more of a reorienting or a reframing. So, for Muslims, for example, many of the words that we take for granted, they've always meant this. They actually had different meaning, and then during the prophetic period, they were reframed and reoriented. Words like salah and zakah and hajj, and these things had meanings beforehand, and then they kind of became reframed and reoriented. And nowadays, if you pick up any sort of traditional classic work on any of the Islamic branches of knowledge, they go to define a word. They'll say linguistically, this word means this, but then in the context of our branch of knowledge or in the context of the Sharia, it means this. So, like case in point, the word salah in Arabic originally meant supplication, just to call to God. And then the word salah or then became known as ritual prayer, the well-known ritual prayer that Muslims do 5 times a day or endeavor to do 5 times a day. So I think in trying to, let's say, take the conversation back to less commodification of people and more thinking about them as a holistic, spiritual being that can be greatly affected and influenced by the way that we present things to them and the way that we design them, then I think the points that you made are very relevant in terms of how we can try to reframe the conversation or reorient in a way. And you mentioned children before, but I think adults also have find themselves in this, I don't want to call it a crisis. I think I read an article in The Guardian maybe the day before yesterday that really, I think, sounding the alarm bell about where all this is going and the attention deficits that people are experiencing. And, people spend upwards of half of their waking hours literally on a mobile device looking at screens. And so I think, if we were to think about, let's say, designing how we would get out of that, where people would have, obviously, technology is technology. It's not going to go away, most likely. But how would we, and we didn't even mention AI yet, but that's another podcast, but let's just keep it to the digital technology in general. How would we go about designing a way for someone to kind of have a judicious and, let's say, healthy view and use of technology, but then rearrange their their capacity to deal with other things healthily as well. And I think one of the books that you quoted, I can't remember which one, maybe it was the Artist's Way, perhaps. You mentioned like 3 things that people should do, and one of them was to have a walk in nature and journaling, and so maybe you could speak to that a little bit.
Yeah, exactly. That's one great memory. Exactly that. So that book, The Artist's Way, which I really almost might want to call a movement by now. I think it was first written in the 80s, the first iterations of it. And I think there's something, very beautiful about, again, the original editions, their subtitle was Creativity as a Spiritual Practice. And when I came across that, especially early in my search, I became so curious about that statement, and so much of it in that book is really just reminders of very timeless understandings that were kind of implicit maybe centuries ago, but kind of had to be repackaged, as you say, Dr. Walead, kind of, or reframed in language in the interface of the day. And understanding the audience. So the 3 things that she recommends, again, they're not, radical new ideas, but they're just, this format she recommends. I see, one is every day try to write your thoughts, ideally on pen and paper, and just, you could call it journaling. You could call it, she calls it morning pages, where you just kind of write your conscious, and it helps you kind of clear. Sometimes you have a heavy, cognitive load, and it just helps you sort of download, if you like, a lot of that noise onto the paper, or some version of that I've found effective over the years. The second is is a weekly walk in nature, at least, and that's obviously a very timeless, beautiful way just to reconnect and being around the natural world and immersing ourselves. We all know how much of an effect that can completely change your state. And then the third one is, she calls it the artist date, which is kind of fun, which is basically once a week, try to take yourself on a bit of a creative excursion, or try something a little new, like maybe going to a museum or exhibit or a cool magazine store or an old secondhand record store or something where you just kind of be in a different creative environment to seek inspiration and gather different perspective. And sometimes weeks and maybe months can go by when we find ourselves maybe creatively drying up a little because we're not sort of remaining in that. And I would go a little further, learning from our teachers is being in this state of awe and wonder and the curiosity. And I remember I had a guest come to my house here in Australia, a great really beautiful and very learned person, and he came to our house, and the first thing he noticed was these beautiful birds. Australia has wonderful bird life, and he goes, what's that kind? How you describe that versus this one? And I felt embarrassed because I didn't know. Like these birds are stunning, and I can give you maybe their common name, but I realized these are remarkable, colorful creation all around us. Just stunning signs of life and color and beauty and flying through these beautiful trees. And I'm like, I didn't even really know much about them. So the point there is like there are signs of awe and wonder and creative majesty all around us. And so we just need to look. And it's a reminder for myself first, because I can find myself too much in the digital world, it's very often. So and I think even in the Quran, you could tell us better, Dr. Waleed, but signs for those who reflect, there's miracles of creation and artistry, all around that remind us, and that inspires our creative practice if we're open and looking.
Yeah. So, Peter, can I just pick up on something there, which you were talking about really in terms of design there? Are there particular modalities? So what I mean by that is there a particular way you set yourself up to be more creative? Like when you are looking to get into a particular zone and to disconnect and to really think and imagine, do you respond better in a particular setting? Because this is a question that people often ask me quite a lot. Like, what's your workspace like designed? How does it work for you? What works for you?
Yeah, this is a fair question, and I don't know that I have a good, podcast worthy answer. Right? What I'll say is that I feel very fortunate that, from I guess as long as I remember, there's a certain creative curiosity. And I remember reading there's a wonderful book by Walter Isaacson, who wrote the Steve Jobs biography. He also wrote one about Da Vinci, and it's a really amazing. He had access to 6,500 pages of Da Vinci's notebooks, and the sort of the summary or the distillation of the end of that whole book, and it's a fascinating read because you have an insight into a daily to-do list from someone who lived at that time. It was an incredible genius, and was relentless curiosity. And so, for example, on one of the pages of the notebooks, the author found, one of Da Vinci's things that day was investigate the tongue of a woodpecker, right? Which is a bird. And how does the tongue work on this and I'm like, what a question to ask. So I guess, Rehan, I feel like somehow baked into me, and sometimes it's to the great annoyance of people around me. Perhaps can be obnoxiously curious about things and being exposed to. I've been very fortunate to travel quite a lot. As part of my work, I get to just walk down a street in Jakarta, visit an old souk in downtown Damascus, or Bastakia, the old area in Dubai, and there's just so much wonder and curiosity. So I think I would say that travel, some of my best, I would say, or most productive creative time is on a 15-hour flight from Sydney to Dubai, when I just have to sit and reflect and sketch and draw, and I have hour after hour to just not be distracted. So sometimes that helps. But I've got no short, cute scientific answer. I think for all of us, what I will say is that I claim none of that on myself. It's really, sometimes you wake up and you have dreams, you have ideas, and you can't really say that told me I thought of this. In fact, I think so many creative leaders and visionaries from, in the musical industry to, artistry, composers, filmmakers, they'll all say when they get into a flow state that they just kind of feel like they're channeling something. They don't really claim their own genius. I think the conscious ones. And for me, that's a clear sign there's a spiritual reality there. You're you maybe perhaps you're channeling or you're conduit of sorts of this creative gifts you've been given. I think the bigger question is, what are we doing with that? Are we going to make are we just going to create? Is it something beneficial? Is it are we helping solve where we can and support and design for positive causes, or are we serving something else with our creativity? And that's a challenge we all got to navigate each year in our professional life.
Yeah, yeah. Dr. Billy, can I ask you the same question in terms of, is there a particular, when you want to be more sort of creative, imaginal, and, you need that time to think, what do you do? Do you set your environment up in a particular way, or can you just go anywhere? And what works for you?
I have to admit, I'm a little bit picky about that. And I find that I will tend to get more work done or things that actually require creativity, like writing. It depends on the environment. So usually I work best when I have, surprisingly, not a very quiet solitude type of place, but somewhere where there's a corner eked out and maybe there's activity happening around me. So like in Istanbul, invariably there's all these cafes all over the place that could be kind of access to the street and out on the sidewalk and pavement. And sometimes I'll just sit there, and literally I can sit there for hours if there's a good Turkish coffee and a steady supply. Then those things actually usually work for me. And I also like to be out kind of in a nature environment. And probably the worst place for me would be something like a confined four walls type of place. So I tend not really to get much done at home in terms of and that sort of thing. And I need to kind of find myself somewhere else, which I guess is a kind of a shortcoming, but trying to overcome it little by bit.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, everyone.
What about you?
Rehan, we both asked
We're
going to answer because one of the things I really admire about you, Rehan, is your disciplined approach to creative practice is really inspirational. Please walk us through some of your amazing habits that I wish I had your level of discipline. It's very inspiring.
Well, today's podcast is talking about you, Peter, but I'll very briefly. I think what works for me is ritual. So the more ritual I have, then the more time I can spend on getting creative. When I don't have to worry about the fact that, okay, I'd have had my tea at this time, or my room is set up, my workflow around me. So everything around me is ritualized, because what that does, I don't have to think about things. I don't have to think about, oh, have I done this? Have I done that? I know I've done it. Everything is set up. So then there's no excuse but to take a deep breath and, like a pearl diver, dive deep. Because when you dive deep like a pearl diver, that's when you find the pearls, right? If you stay in the shallows, you're not going to find it. It's only when you go deep. And so your mind is like that. Everyone's mind is full of these beautiful jewels, but you have to take a deep breath. And so I think ritual is, for me, is the most important thing. When I'm in a ritual, I can pretty much write anywhere. Okay. I prefer writing in my home environment. Just outside my window, I have this tree, and there's like 7-8 types of birds come. And I did learn the name of all the birds, Peter, because I was also one day looking outside my window and I realized I didn't know the names of these birds. So I learned the names. And fortunately, there's about 10 types of birds that come in this area. So anyway, so I for me, that works better, but I can work anywhere. But the more ritual I have, the more planning I've done in advance, then the more easier it becomes for me. Whereas I can't do it in a hodgepodge kind of way, or if an email just come in that's very emotive, it'll kind of disturb me. I don't want to look at it, So often I won't check my WhatsApps, I won't check my email until much later in the day, because my mind is clear. But that's what works for me. So
I think one thing I'm curious about that between all three of us, we one thing, even just stepping a little adjacent to the question around creativity is that one thing I absolutely detected so often as I started to share a little bit about my creative work and our design studio became at more reach and people seeing and being interested in the kind of projects we're doing, was so often you would hear someone say, usually an adult, always an adult, I should say, oh, I'm not the creative type. Oh, I'm not the creative one. I can't draw. Right. Oh, you should speak to so and so. They're the creative one. They're the artsy one. This is such a common refrain. And I have to say, many Muslim communities I visit, I feel even, this is, I'll find incredible doctors, engineers, lawyers as the sort of the common refrain might go. And I would say, well, no, that's very unfair to yourself. You can absolutely be the most creative engineer, the most creative doctor. You will be inventing the med tech or the approaches to, save lives or think of beautiful ways to help someone with their hearing. That's all creative practice. So I guess what I would encourage us to do is if we're ever finding ourselves limiting creative work or creativity to visual work like drawing or sketching, that's very unfair. Creative work is our mindset, is our ability to problem solve and be open and reduce our fear of judgment, of experimentation. And you'll find what I loved as I was learning about Islam and the civilizational history of all these great innovators and thinkers and inventors and Farabi and Ibn Firnas and and of course from many traditions, just the very the experimental kind of curiosity and trying to understand flight or chemistry, alchemy and so many of the beautiful sciences that became mature over years. Great minds thinking, exploring, being creative. It's let's embrace that. Let's just not ever limit ourselves to thinking we're not creative because we're not an artist or something. So that's my one request for anyone listening, and it's the one request I don't have in my programs is you can't say, oh, I'm not the creative one, and go draw something. It's fun. it's good for the brain to use different, faculties that you've been gifted. If they're a little rusty, that's okay. Just have a go.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, Peter. And I think we were talking earlier about creativity and spirituality and how they feed one another. And it's defining spirituality very broadly, getting out of yourself. And you talked about a flow state, and me and Rayhan had a conversation about that, I think, recently also. And I think that's when, and you mentioned this in the book also, when you're really kind of in an inspired way, and that works when you're not in yourself, right? You're kind of out of yourself. It's almost like you're a witness or a participant watching. And the Muslim sages, they talk about this idea of witnessing or mushahada. So you're more like a witness to things happening, even your own self, rather than kind of this egoistic kind of driver that's just trying to fulfill whatever personal needs that you think are there. And I think we haven't talked about this, but I think happiness is very much included in the conversation when we talk about creativity, spirituality. And people who've tried it, and remarkably, they'll all say the same thing. You're happiest when you're serving others, when you're not, when it's not just about yourself. And I think you mentioned in the book that was the light bulb moment for you when creativity was about serving others and in whatever capacity you can do that. And I think that's creative, right? If we define the term loosely, I mean, when you can bring something to other people, you are creating something, right? You're bringing something to other people. So I was wondering if you had any other thoughts about that.
Yeah, well, as it happened at our studio last night, we were very blessed to have one of my dear friends and teachers, Dr. Samir Mahmoud, do a 2-hour session around creativity and imagination. So I feel like I kind of cheated because I got so much inspiration from that, and he was able to still. He's an incredible source of helping people like me unpack and understand, very deep kind of perhaps metaphysical concepts around creativity and the unseen realm from which we imagine something and then bring that, accelerate, as he would say, that from a passing thought to an intention to an act of creativity. And he's a much better person to describe this in a sort of structured, grounded way. But, for example, he was talking about and helping us explore, well, what is the human capacity for creativity? If we look at sort of the Islamic perspective on, there is the absolute source of creativity, the creator. And we looked at different names, Allah having, 99 names and attributes. So if we looked at, al-Musawwir, the fashion of forms, and there's an absolute source. I know, Dr. Walead, you'll do a much better job of this, but he then sort of had to help us simplify a little bit, a visual guide to then, other acts of creativity that we participate. We of course are not ever originators of those forms, but we are. He said musawwirun. I think musawwirin. We participate in giving form and in bringing the capacity to imagine into something that we hope might be for positive and helpful means, but of course a lot of people would use it for all kinds of means. And he gave the example, some people could imagine terrible things and designing weapons and creating that, but in its noble form, that imagination is for bringing beauty in the world and inviting people to beauty and to contemplate on the divine and contemplate on our higher self. So he's a great resource to. He's helped me a lot and has informed my book and thinking around exploring the nature of imagination. But the last thing I'll say there is that I went through 4 years of design school. Alhamdulillah, I spent a lot of time being curious about the role of creativity and design and innovation in mostly in places like Australia, the US, and a little bit Europe. But it was only 10 years into my journey that I heard, the concept of khayal, which you mentioned, Rehan, and started to realize that I knew actually really nothing about the incredible depth and nature of imagination. It's this vast realm of knowledge that I feel, another 10 years in, just still kind of stepping into. And it's really just, I think the takeaway for there is maybe that, we have incredible potential for creativity. Our imagination is not just about fantasy and, whimsy. Imagination is a very powerful faculty that we're all gifted with. So let's maybe take time to explore, the depths of that further if we haven't already.
Yeah. No, thanks, Peter. And I think, exploring that level of creativity or undertaking a craft, what I would say requires, continuous practice and improvement over a lifetime. Because some people, they try it, so, oh, it doesn't work for me, I can't do it, and they give up. But actually, it is literally over a lifetime. I mean, I've been writing novels now for 16 years, and I feel like only now I'm getting into my stride. Like literally, for 16 years, I've just been trying to improve. And even now I'm like, compared to the great writers, I'm nowhere near anything near where they are, but I'm kind of getting into my stride, and that's 16 years. So I think, craft is very much a continuous practice over a lifetime, in the same way that I think the journey to know God is also a quest that takes place over a lifetime. And so I think there's quite a lot to learn there, because that's a lifetime endeavor and a craft is a lifetime endeavor. So in many ways, I think if you can apply yourself to a craft and have that discipline and have that eagerness to go deep into the craft, you can also apply yourself to a spiritual journey, to that quest, to that, wayfaring back to God as well.
Rehan, if I can share one of my favorite examples, I think that exemplifies that so beautifully. And you're absolutely right, that experience. I think you hit your stride some years ago, by the way, just as a fan of your book. But mashallah, I love someone that's been a deep inspiration for myself and many people is Peter Sanders, or Abdulaziz Sanders, and you might call that the craft of photography. So on one level, that it's the craft and the artistry of photography, but the even deeper at a kind of spiritual level. One of his most well-known and beautiful books is called The Art of Seeing. The Art of Seeing. And there's, I think, a deep sort of message in that, that witnessing, or that observational, the inward and the outward kind of awareness. And his photography, there's layers and there's beauty and there's the way that he both shares his work with others and exhibitions and books, but inwardly, I think he's someone I look to as a great example of, a professional, a creative who is, been working consistently, as you say, on this path technically for 50 years plus, 55 years, mashallah, but also, he's so grounded, his character, his nature, he's helping people, he's always in service, mashallah. So, his manners, this is, I aspire to be someone like him one day in terms of that holistic understanding of the craft of being a good person, inshallah. But anyway, I thought to mention that he came to mind when you mentioned that lifelong journey back to God, but your creative practice, your professional work, if it's in alignment with your intentionality, and you go through the ups and downs, the difficult moments, they're all part of that growth. And alhamdulillah, there's lots of examples in history for us to learn from and have one another like you two to remind us of these examples and moments and signs, the way stations, especially when things are tough and many of us will face a lot of challenges professionally. It's in our creative work. It's part of the nature of that growth.
Yeah, yeah. No, great. Now, I was going to ask you actually a question about your mentors and teachers, and I think you've mentioned Peter Sanders there very beautifully, and I think that story encapsulates it really well. Dr. Walead, before we just get a few book recommendations from each of us, is there anything else you want to just add to what Peter said before we?
Yeah, maybe just a parting thought. I think you hit it on the nose. Just like in creativity, spirituality, it's there's no end point. I mean, it's not like we think of journey and then we think of starting point and end point of. In actuality, there is no end point. I don't want to use a cliche, but the journey is a destination. So as you're, and then you don't actually, you may assume there's an end point. And, in Islamic spirituality, they say if you think there's an end point, then that's the veil that's keeping you from going beyond what your perception of an end point is. And so I think, you said it earlier, Peter, that, people say, I'm not the creative type. That's like putting an endpoint for yourself. It's like limiting and saying, like, I can't do this, and this is my ability, this is where it stops. And I think anyone who's done really, really great things and their names have been recorded for posterity, and those were people who didn't think like that. And I don't think they think about themselves as I could have accomplished this, and they planned to do it. Probably more, it was like they just took the road where it takes them, and they found themselves getting to higher and higher places, and so they just went with it. And then that's when you're kind of like outside of yourself, and you just it's let the thing take me where it goes, and I'm on for the ride. And so hopefully we all could have a little bit of that and be in for the ride and have sohbah in doing it. We do it together, inshallah. And it was wonderful to talk to you about all these things on this podcast. Alhamdulillah.
Yeah, no, great. Thank you. I think we could keep going for several hours, but I think we need to start to wind the show up. So, Peter, any kind of books that you can recommend in line with what we've been speaking about with regards to design?
Yeah, I think specifically, and by the way, Dr. Lee, beautiful reflection. Thank you so much for that reminder. I think for those curious about design and maybe exploring a little deeper, especially if you haven't necessarily encountered and interacted with design or thinking of yourself of having designer capacity or designer mindset, and that's something I would love to see more people. That's a part of, I think, what I'd love to advocate for is, don't undersell your ability to help problem solve and contribute. Embrace this kind of design-led thinking and whatever you might be working on. And so some of the books that specifically around design that have been, I think, really powerful in this space, one of the earliest ones that really, I think, was a landmark that's still taught in, I think, good design schools, is called Design for the Real World by Victor Papanek, who I think the book was written in the early 70s, 1970 something. And it's basically a kind of scathing assessment of what was a period of incredible consumerism, cars destroying the planet through just burning endless fossil fuels, big consumer focus rather than, poverty and social issues of the day. So that was like really set the stage for what, this slow journey, I think, towards more conscious type of design in some circles. And I guess the sort of counterpart to that, I kind of think of it as the digital equivalent of that, written just maybe 5 years ago, is called Ruined by Design. Ruined by Design. And the subtitle is How Designers Destroyed the World and What We Can Do About It. And he basically gives another scaling assessment of the same, but in the digital era, and talks a lot about the issues around technology and optimizing for dopamine and addiction and so on, but then offers some ways to do it. I think what I'm inshallah, God willing, trying to do with the heart of design is recognize the great work in texts like those, but also offer us an invitation to a more spiritually grounded perspective as well, and layer in these timeless, beautiful, universal spiritual aspirations that resonate with all of us on some level, and how we might consciously kind of apply those to some of our own efforts, inshallah. So there's two great books or audio books to add to the list.
Thank you, Peter. And Peter's next Heart of Design program, 5-week program, if you want to take it, will be starting in April. I think second week of April, I think, Peter, right?
Yeah. That's
I think
right.
it's
That's right.
Yeah, so just go to his website and you can follow the links from there and sign up for that. Dr. Walead, any books that you would recommend?
Yeah, I would say Peter mentions early in his book also about the divine names of Allah. So I think if people are more interested in that, then they should check out Ghazali's Maqsad al-Husna, Maqsad al-Asna fi Asma al-Husna, which is his book, and it's available in English. And I think Ahmed Zarruq also has one that I believe is available in English. And if you're into Khayal, I know the two of you collaborated on Tales of Khayal, so that's kind of a real world output of the concepts that we've been talking about. So I also recommend that also.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much for mentioning that. I think from my side, the book I would recommend would be What is Art by Leo Tolstoy. What is Art by Leo Tolstoy. It's a great Russian novelist, obviously, and this was the last work of nonfiction that he wrote. He'd led a very bohemian life, and towards the end of his life, he'd become quite a devout Christian, Eastern Orthodox Christian, I believe. And he really kind of decries the fact that in his time, in the 19th century, artists are pursuing and creating art as self-expression, as ego-driven exercises, as seeking fame. And he says that art is really about reminding people about God through the art. So the artist remembers God when performing the art, and the person who benefits from the art should also remember God as well. So it's a very short book, but it's a very profound book. And I say it's the last book that he wrote, and he knew he was going to die. So he had an ongoing illness. So I think there's a lot of weight in those words. So that's What is Art by Leo Tolstoy. All right, great. Well, let's bring the show to a close. And big thank you once again to our special guest, Peter Gould, speaking about the heart of design. Thank you so much, Peter. It was lovely speaking to you. And
likewise, thank you so much, Pat.
Really, really great. And thank you again to my co-host, Dr. Walead. And peace be upon you to all of our listeners. Thank you so much.